Yes, good afternoon, and it's my pleasure to introduce and moderate the capital markets panel, which is usually one of the highlights of a typical ULI conference. And specifically, I think today we have 4 representatives, representing 4 firms, and I was calculating in my head how much real estate the 4 of them were representing, and I think it's probably more than 100 billion of real estate with the 4 of them. So I'm sure they'll give you an interesting, sharing their experience on investing in real estate, not just in their respective regions, but also global, because all 4 of them are global players. So from the left to right, starting with Zhou Azrack, he's Senior Advisor to Apollo Global Real Estate, of which he has been the founder and past Chairman and CEO. Prior to that, he was the CEO of City Property Investors, as well as CEO of AEW Capital Management. He's also a professor at Columbia on real estate and entrepreneurship. Next to him, Chris Heady, Senior Managing Director. He's the head of Asia for Blackstone. Chris has worked in all continents, I believe, so has experience in all 3. And more importantly, he's spearheading Blackstone's efforts here in Australia, here in Asia, covering Australia, Japan, China, India, all very big markets. And he's going to tell us more about Blackstone's appetite going forward. Andrew Zhou, Chairman and Chief Executive of Penang Real Estate, joined the insurance company in 2010 to make it a global player. Prior to that, he was a director and general management of Sanhang Kai Real Estate. He's based in Shanghai and will share with us, the new power Chinese insurance companies represent in the real estate scene. And then finally, Ryan Botjer, Senior Managing Director and Country Head for Tishman Speyer. He opened the office for Tishman Speyer in China in 2006. They have large projects ongoing in that country. He knows China very well. He already moved there in 1996. He speaks fluent Mandarin, but today we'll speak in English. So the way we're going to organize the panel, each of the panel members are going to basically first give a little introduction about their respective companies. We know them, they are very famous, but it's good to hear what is the latest activity of their respective firms. Then we're going to start it off with a question related to their main area of activity, and I hope that the other team members will chime in and debate it. And then we'll try to cover both, the latest in, what are the investment criteria they are looking for, what are the geographies they are favoring, what are the type of products they're going after. If we have time, we'll do a small quiz, and then hopefully there will be Q&A from many of you here for the panel, and that will round off our panel discussion for today. So, Joe, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Francois, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here. Apollo Global Management is a very large alternative asset manager. Most of the assets are in credit or private equity. The real estate group has something north of 10 billion of assets under management. It's a global business, Europe, Asia, and the US. Most of the assets today are located in Europe and the US. We've been divesting into a seller's market in Asia for the past few years. We have both a debt business, which is primarily mezzanine investing for a public company and a couple of separate accounts, as well as an equity investment business where we've been most active in NPLs and value-add opportunities in Europe, and primarily value-add and some opportunistic investments in the United States. Chris?
Thanks for having me here today. My name is Chris Heady. I'm with the Blackstone Group, Senior Managing Director, and I oversee our real estate business in Asia. I'm based here in Hong Kong. Blackstone, as many of you know, is an alternative asset manager like Apollo, and we have a large real estate private equity business that operates globally. We also have a real estate debt lending business and have been active in Asia since really our first office here in 2006, and have, as Francois mentioned, predominantly focused on the larger economies in this part of the world, so including China, India, Japan, and Australia, and have a diverse portfolio of assets including retail, office, industrial, hospitality, etc.
Thank you. Andrew?
各位好，感谢 UAI 给我一个机会在这里跟大家讲讲我们公司。我是平安不动产有限公司的CEO。平安不动产是中国平安集团的一个下属公司。中国平安是一个以保险、银行投资为主体的一个公司。目前平安的总资产大概是4万亿人民币。平安不动产呢，主要是一个专门在这平安集团底下做一个房地产投资的一个公司。主要有2个责任，一个是帮平安的保险资金寻找一些匹配的一个收租的一个资产。第2个也管理一个平安的管理一个房地产投资基金，为我们平安集团的一些高端客户寻找一些房地产投资的机会。我们目前的主要的工作还是在国内，也尝试的对国际上做一些了解。讲完。
Thank you. My name is Ryan Botjer. I head Tishman Speyer's business in China. Tishman Speyer is a private real estate developer, investor, and fund manager. We're headquartered in New York, but have operations throughout the U.S., Europe, India, Brazil, and China. We have approximately $36 billion of assets under management, predominantly in the office and residential sector. We've been active in Asia since 2006 in both the India and China markets.
Great. Thank you for that short introduction. So, as I said, we have the capacity to cover all markets here this afternoon. So we're going to start with the US market and what's happening over there. And so my question will go to Zhou. The US is probably the #1 sought after market in terms of destination for capital coming out of Asia. When you speak to investors in Korea or China, they all want to invest in the 24/7 American cities. They have seen good growth over the last few years, even sharp increase in prices like in Manhattan. So, is it too late to invest in the US, and how do you see the capital flows currently?
Yeah. Well, to take the second part first, the cross-border capital flows into the United States, the largest component has been from Canada, followed by Europe and the Middle East, and third from Asia. However, the rate of increase has been highest from Asia, so I think it's highly likely that this year, unlike 2013, Asia will probably be the second largest source of capital of cross-border investment in real estate in the United States. The thing about the U.S. market, excuse me, as I'm sure everybody is aware, it's a very large and diverse market. It's very deep. There's a lot of product that trades every year. It's a significant public and a private market, and it's really probably on the order of several $1 trillion just on the commercial side between the public and the private. So what we've seen since the crisis, really, I think, has been due to the zero interest rates and the search for yield, is a decline in yield and an increase in price, primarily of core assets, particularly in gateway cities. However, when you peel the onion a little bit and look a little more closely, the valuations of secondary markets, but still significant metropolitan areas in the United States, and properties that what we would call core plus or value add, those that need some capital investment, perhaps better management and the like. There's still quite a few of those properties that have what I would call significant mid-teens return on investment potential. So it's a different market than it has been these past few years, but it's due to the demographics, due to the GDP growth and the like, and simply the magnitude of debt, legacy debt that needs to be refinanced. It's there has been no shortage of transaction opportunities, although I do think there has been an evolution from the focus on core into slightly up the risk curve.
Secondary cities, still okay? Secondary cities in the US?
Yeah, when I say a secondary city, instead of Los Angeles, I might mean Seattle. Okay. Instead of Washington, D.C., it might be, I'd say Miami is on the cusp, but it might be Atlanta, might be in Austin, Texas. Chicago's clearly a gateway city. Boston, New York, Washington, D.C. are. But when you start looking at places like Denver, the Raleigh-Durham area, for example, San Diego even, you know, these are still substantial markets with very liquid and deep real estate markets, and most importantly, strong employment bases. What we've seen in the United States, while the overall unemployment rate has declined and GDP growth has been, you know, approaching 3% overall, what's really interesting is when you look more carefully, you see that most of the growth in employment and hence demand for real estate has been in the energy markets and in the technology and the media and telecom. So you start looking at places like the Bay Area, the West Coast markets, Boston, the Southeast, places like that.
Well, and you, besides being active in China, you also help sourcing, bringing, I think, Chinese money to the US. What's the view from a Tishman Speyer point of view on the US market, or what you hear from the Chinese investors willing to go there?
Well, I think we're very optimistic about the U.S. market. I mean, we're predominantly in the core gateway cities, and I think in some of the markets, for instance, like San Francisco, we've seen really strong demand both in the office sector as well as in the residential sector, and obviously that's in part due to the strength of the tech economy and the tech market, which Zhou mentioned in the past. But I think one of the interesting dynamics in the U.S. right now is that because there is not a lot of supply in the marketplace, we really think that there is an interesting opportunity on new development in the U.S. And I think in almost all of our major cities right now, we're looking at new construction and new development opportunities.
Okay, great, Chris.
You know, we're active investors in the U.S. But you know, I guess just as a point of clarification, Blackstone is primarily focused on opportunistic returns.
Yes.
And I think if we look at the U.S. now versus a few years ago, certainly capital is back. There's not as much distress as there used to be. So from an opportunistic perspective, there's probably less opportunity than there was a few years ago. But I think from a fundamentals perspective, in our portfolio, we continue to see strong growth. Yeah. And I think, as Zhou mentioned, construction activity by historical standards is still pretty low. Yeah. And so while the distress is no longer prevalent, there's also not a great degree of construction activity, which is good for the market and obviously presents opportunities for folks like Tishman that want to build new buildings.
Now, having said that, you have a very ambitious and aggressive investment targets and the company as a whole, so multi-billion investments you will have to do in the coming years based on the money you have raised. So let's put the US aside. You know, I think the questions people might have is, you know, are there actually enough opportunities across the world just for the Blackstone capital alone to invest?
Well, we believe there are. Actually, most of our activity, not most, if you looked at our activity, it has shifted to a degree to focus more internationally, as in ex-United States. Obviously, we're based in New York. Certainly, the U.S. continues to be a big component of what we do, but we're increasingly spending more time and capital in other parts of the world, including Europe. We recently raised a European fund and have been very active there, pursuing distressed opportunities. And I think for many investors, that presents a great opportunity over the next couple of years. Certainly, the core markets in Europe, London, Paris, etc., have recovered significantly from the depths of the financial crisis, but there's still a lot of complicated situations that need to get worked out, and that presents a great opportunity for opportunistic investors. And then likewise, I think here in Asia, given investor sentiment, particularly in the public capital markets, for investors that have medium to long-term perspective and are selective in what they do, there are, in our view, lots of interesting opportunities.
Is there a particular market in Asia where you wish you could have invested, or you could invest more than there is actual possibilities? Or
I would
basically get what you want? Yeah.
Well, you know, we as I mentioned, we're active in 4 markets, mainly 4 markets, so China, Japan, Australia, and India. Yeah. And we've done quite a bit of business in Japan, but I would say if we were giving ourselves a self-critique, we probably should have done more prior to Abenomics and what that's done for asset prices. We didn't quite anticipate probably the degree which that's helped asset values, and in retrospect, we would have liked to have bought a lot more. But that might be one area.
What you didn't get in Japan, you all get it in India with the new election. So well done in terms of sentiment change.
Well, we're longer-term investors, so we'll see how things play out over the next few years.
Now, Andrew, let's come to you. Chinese investors are becoming increasingly global, and the capital flow is becoming more and more organized and effective. From China towards overseas markets. Now, the returns still remain high in China. A lot of people obviously still investors there. So, why do Chinese investors, go abroad? Or maybe saying it differently, is the smart money leaving the country?
中国的钱这几年出去确实是明显的比钱要多了很多。那么多了很多的话，我觉得主要还是有几种因素的。首先一个就是中国人在海外的这种留学和移民的量越来越大，特别是最近的几年，如果是留学生的话，中国在过去的20年里边所积累的留学生已经900多万。那么中国的留学生里边有从小学开始留学的出去的都有，然后这些留学生里边有很多是家庭比较好的，有钱的，有些人会是母亲，全职的在海外陪小孩在外边读书的，所以他们有的人会在外边买一些房子，供这个留学生和他的母亲住。第二个就是家庭移民的其实也蛮多的。这可能因为这个有人为了签证的出国的方便啊，旅游的方便啊，等等各种各样的因素。当然有另外一个因素，是因为这几年在外国很多政府对也放宽了这个移民的政策，特别是投资移民 EB5。像美国的话，12年大概有7000多个 EB5 出来。其中有6000多个就是中国人得到的，那么占了80%，是不是很多人的投资移民好都会带来一个就是他们购买购买住宅的一个需求。另外，中国的企业在海外的业务扩展，也令他们带来了一个对写字楼和居住的一个需求。当然，第三个原因就是可能就是国内的企业或者个人，他们有一个海外配置资产分享的这么一个需求，这都使得这几年中国跑出去的钱会多了很多。
What are they most concerned about as they think about investing abroad? What would be their main concern as they think about their investments abroad?
是的，对于这些投资者到海外去做的投资的话，从企业的角度来讲，目前主要是买写字楼为主。他们所关心的最主要的是 liquidity， 流动性够不够，还有就是法律啊、税务的一方面的一些因素。当然return yield 够不够也是他们所考虑的一个因素。对于个人的话，主要是投资住宅为主的。住宅的话，相当部分的投资者还是投资以自用为目的的，说投资来做收租回报的人有，但量不会太大。而开发商出去做住宅开发这块呢，这严格讲应该是从12年、13年才开始的。那么他们这里边呢，可能去一些。我关注到他们主要去一些华人比较愿意去的那些城市，然后借助他们在国内的声誉，然后他们的相当一部分客人会是华人的一个买者，所以他们会更关注这方面多一点。
We are at the beginning of a trend. What's your estimate? Maybe in 5 years from now, would it be 10 times or 100 times what do we see today? If you had to pick between the two numbers, which one would you pick?
我想不出来，要想出来的话，我马上公司就出去干了。但是可以看到，就是说这几年这种增长的趋势是蛮快的，可能有几个原因，包括除了刚才所讲的原因之外，也包括中国的经济周期跟国外的经济周期的一个差别。现在中国的经济正在走在一个corner 的位置上，可能目前的经济的速度相对来讲减慢了一点。我们房地产的销售也会相对的慢下来了一点，这些都会刺激这帮人会往外边多走的一些。可以看到我们国内的开发商出去的量是很厉害的，因为譬如说像万科也好，绿地也好，他们在中国的销售额每年都是过1000亿的，1000亿是一个非常大的量。那么他们现在都是只是尝试性的去做这方面的事情。尝试性的去做，那么当他们觉得摸索完之后，他们觉得已经是他们能够驾驭这个市场，那可能会他们稍微增大一下量，那个量就可能会是很大。但100倍，我觉得不太可能。
Yeah, the translator just said 100. That's okay. Now, Ryan, you obviously, you are heavily involved in China. It's mainly development. Now, when Tishman Speyer does project in Manhattan, it's landlocked. Manhattan is Manhattan. It's not going to get bigger. But China is so different. So how do you assess the risk of oversupply as you think about your projects?
Well, look, I think the supply-demand dynamics are obviously critical towards a successful real estate investment. In the emerging markets, much more so than in a mature city like Manhattan, I think that an even more important component to that equation is really demographic trends, right? So if you think about China, the story is really about urbanization, wealth creation, a growing middle class, investment into all of the infrastructure, so the ability to build real estate in association with transit hubs, whether it's subways or high-speed trains. All of those components, I think, create real long-term real estate value over the long term, right? And I also think that when you look at the headline numbers in these cities and the vacancy rates, you have to understand that the quality of product is very diverse, the location of product is very diverse. In many cities today, on the commercial real estate side, the majority of product has been strata title sold. So really in terms of institutional quality, stock of institutional quality real estate, it's very minimal in some cases. And I think the other component of it is, when you look at the emerging markets, is that the real inherent growth and the drivers of demand that are underlying and underpinning the entire economy. So what you see are typically much shorter cycles than you would see in the US, for instance. If you look at Beijing in 2009, 2010, the office market had a vacancy in excess of 30%. 2 years later, that was single digits and rents had gone through the roof. And so I think that in these markets where you do have real inherent demand, those dynamics can change very quickly.
Is India similar in that regard, or?
Well, we're focused in India mainly on the office space.
Yeah.
So I can talk more confidently about that. And it also relates a little bit to what Zhou was saying about technology being an engine for growth in the US.
Yes.
That has played out in India insofar as IT services companies are selling goods and services to American and European companies. And certainly in that market, we've seen, even in the depths of the worst years in crisis, demand from office users has increased every year. I mean, occupied square meters every year has increased. And the same is true in Beijing. I think if you went back, even when it was 30% vacant, the number of square meters that were occupied the year before, obviously has grown. And that's not necessarily true in Western economies, where the number of occupied square feet actually goes down because employment growth has declined or has reduced. So I think certainly that dynamic is at work. The other thing I would add, just generally about this, is a little bit about the capital markets, but Our view is that as it relates to countries like China and India, which are clearly in a process of deleveraging, credit-intensive industries like real estate will be affected, and construction activity on a widespread basis will probably go down over the next couple of years. Obviously, on a project-by-project basis, you have to look at the individual dynamics of whatever you're investing in, but my sense is probably in terms of percentage growth year over year, construction activity is actually going down as credit dwindles, and that should be good for the long term if you continue to see strong economic growth, which I think most of us share the view that particularly in places like China, you're going to see relatively strong growth for the medium to long term.
Ryan, any view on the other emerging markets? I think Tishman is also active in Brazil.
We're active in India, Brazil, Turkey, and China. So those are the markets on the emerging market side. I mean, yeah, look, I would say in India today, there's a lot of optimism. We just went through a historic election there, and I think there's a lot of optimism that Modi brings to the table, that he can really push things forward, that he can have the same success on a national level that he had in his home state of Gujarat. We still like very much the dynamics that surround that market. We think the economy has more or less bottomed out. We've seen the currency strengthen since its low during the summer of last year. They're doing what they can to fight inflation. We see a growth in the office sector, and we think in the residential side, the urbanization story is there too. So I guess the one question there is, are the expectations now too high, and how long is it going to take before that real momentum happens? But over the mid to long term, we're very positive. In Brazil, growth has been sluggish. They have high inflation, interest rates are high now at 11%. It's an election year, which means that there really is more status quo this year than anything else. I think the current regime is seen to be less business friendly, and so what happens during this election is going to have an impact on investor sentiment moving forward. But there as well, we think that there is a real need in the office sector for quality product. In Sao Paulo, for instance, still 40–45% of the office buildings don't have central air conditioning. And so I think that there is an increased demand, and there will continue to be, for quality real estate. Turkey, look, we really like the dynamics, the fundamentals of Turkey. You've got a median population age of 29. Istanbul is a city of 16 million people. Very limited quality stock of office real estate. The office stock is something like 3.5 million square meters. A lot of multinational companies have a growth strategy there. They have been hit hard with the tapering process. A lot of capital is left. Their currency's taken a hit, and again, in that market, we've seen interest rates rise to try to control inflation. So I guess around all of those markets, we see near-term volatility and challenges, but we still really believe in the mid to long-term fundamentals. And in many cases, I think this may be an interesting buying opportunity in the near term.
Russia is missing in that discussion.
Yeah,
we'll have to speak about BRICS versus BRICS soon. Or,
we haven't yet entered Russia.
Chris, no. Zhou, no.
Russia?
Yeah, no. Okay. Let's move topics then.
Don't get me started.
No, okay. Relative value of property investment between the U.S. and Europe, for example. How do you know the European market well, U.S. market.
Yeah.
Why invest in Europe?
Beats me.
Oh.
No, I'm just kidding. Look at the thesis is, of course, it's where the U.S. was in terms of the property markets, where the U.S. was maybe 3 or 4 years ago in terms of, overall, there's $1 trillion of bank debt that needs to be refinanced, that's underperforming, et cetera, a large portion of which is real estate or real estate related. The question is, how much of that is going to stay in the European Central Bank directly or indirectly, and how much is going to come into the market, and how will it be priced? And in the short run, to date at least, I think there's more capital lined up for this, as evidenced by the prices that are being paid and the expected returns. than there is product coming into the market. Many of our organizations are making the bet that that's going to change over time because market forces will require that. It remains to be seen. The fundamentals in Europe vary. The UK looks pretty good today. Germany has held up pretty well. France has been struggling. Spain seems to have turned the corner, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to generalize. But I think the real question is whether you can get a acceptable return, particularly if you're buying a loan as opposed to the real estate, and depending upon which country you're in, you have to go through various steps to get to that level, and whether one will be able to do enough volume to justify the resources necessary to play in the market. On the other hand, in the U.S., you've got a deep market, a liquid market, a transparent market, a strong economy. I'd say we're not more than halfway through the recapitalization of the commercial property market in the United States, so there's still a way to go. It's transitioning maybe to more of a make or redevelop market than just a buy, in part because there's so much functional obsolescence in most of the property sectors because of the impact of technology and on the demand side and what that necessitates on the product. But overall, I think there is a broader, deeper market with, relatively better value in the U.S. today than Europe. There could be some very good opportunities that will come up in Europe, but so far the volume has been relatively limited.
I guess the question can also be, is the market distressed enough to take into account maybe slow growth? So you need to make the money up front, so through some sort of discount.
Yeah, the fundamentals, the demographics, and the employment growth again vary. I think most of the return one is going to get is going to be on either the current return on a levered basis, and or by repositioning the asset into a different type of use. But I think it's going to be a little bit heavier lift than you don't have the dynamic demand that you have in the growth markets in Latin America and in Asia. Each of those markets, may have their own challenges in terms of what's going on in the economies, but you can feel pretty confident that the demand for your product is going to be there. That is not necessarily the case in Europe.
I think more generally, though, people could ask the question, why is now a good time to invest in real estate? I mean, interest rates are all-time low, so there's only one way interest rate will go up eventually. It's up, not further down. Why is now still a good time to buy real estate?
I'll just take a quick shot at that. Firstly, on a yield basis, property yields in mortgages, mezzanine loans, and even in equities still compare favorably to the alternatives. So that's just on the yield side. Secondly, with the exception of Class A assets in gateway markets in the U.S. at least, most properties are still trading at a significant discount to what the replacement cost is, which is why there hasn't been a lot of supply. Now, property values, land values, and building costs are escalating rapidly in the United States, so that's going to change within the next few years. But so far, the fundamentals, because of the lack of supply and because of the growth that's occurred in the market, I think look very, very good. Chris?
Yeah, I would echo that. The lack of construction activity and the fact that you can buy assets below replacement cost is a very compelling reason to be investing in real estate, and even relative to other asset classes. And the other thing I'd add is in terms of interest rate rises, it really depends on why they're rising. If interest rates are rising because the economy is doing a lot better and there's more employment and there's more demand, then history would suggest that that's not necessarily a bad thing for real estate. It's actually probably a good thing for real estate. So now, on the other hand, if you look at, let's say economies where interest rates are rising to kind of attract capital because there's distress, then that could be a different situation where there's low growth and higher interest rates. But I think in the U.S., certainly you're seeing if there's going to be interest rate increases, it's probably because the economy is doing very well, which is going to be good for real estate.
Andrew, why is a good time to invest in real estate? I guess there's nothing else to invest in China.
That's not nice.
We do a lot in China, by the way, so we invest a lot in China. Okay. In other things than real estate as well. So.
对中国人来讲，投资房地产永远都是时机，因为中国人一直都非常喜欢房地产。如果是说投资海外的房地产的话，跟中国的房地产相比来讲，我刚才讲就是说有一个房地产有一个周期上的一个差别。那么可以看到，就中国的房地产是这过去的20-30年是一直是涨得非常厉害的，那么到现在呢，逐步慢下来了。但是我们看回伦敦啊、纽约啊、东京啊这些房地产的话，我们就会感觉到，它在过去的几年，它是相对的是下来的比较多。当然，像美国的话会上来的比较快一点。伦敦在去年开始也是往上走了。但总体来讲呢，我们认为跟中国相比较来讲，我们不觉得它比中国贵，或者是甚至觉得我会比中国稍微便宜一点。可能这种便宜点，包括我们主要是从它 U 来说的。那么当然就是说用海外，假如能够用海外的资金，它的interest rate 相对的比较低一点，也会帮助我们觉得可以让它的 gearing 之后呢，它的rental yield 可以得到一个更好的一个回报。所以这就是也可能就是为什么最近会有一些一个时期里边中国的房地投资者开始往外边买东西的一个原因。
Ryan, anything to add?
Not really. I think these three gentlemen pretty much covered that topic.
I'm convinced as well. Good time to invest in real estate.
Absolutely.
Then the second question is, fine, but why is now a good time to move up the risk curve? Or on the contrary, it's good to invest, but minimize the risk. Of course, most people are moving up the risk curve these days.
Well, is it a good time to move up the risk curve? It depends on what your objectives are, right? If you're and what your time horizon is. For example, in Asia, we've been a seller in Asia because we think there's been so much domestic capital in the Asian market that it's not possible to get what we think is a premium for our capital coming from the U.S. and Europe in Asia. But on the other hand, if one is looking for diversification out of, say, a European or a U.S. economy, Asia is certainly one of the places you want to look, and particularly if you are a long-term holder, 10 or 20 years, because the fundamentals are going to be very, very good. And what's going on now in the major markets in Asia is probably going to sort itself out over the next 18 to 36 months, and in the long run, it won't be that important. I think the important thing to keep in mind about moving up the risk curve is, A, do you have the tolerance? Are you doing it intentionally? And how are you doing it? There are a lot of ways to mitigate risk as you go up the curve in terms of your strategy and financial structure and the like. To do it, if you will, naively, where you just don't even realize that there's more risk being taken on and one is unable to mitigate some of those risks, that's usually not such a good idea. And of course, that's the challenge for any investor who is trying to get out a certain amount of capital in a given period of time. The weight of capital can drive one to do certain things, or anyone who is new to a market. It may be Asian investors in Europe or the US, or US investors in a different region, or somebody who's always been an income investor moving into the development side. You really need to understand what you're getting into in order to be able to manage that risk. So I think you can't just say yes or no, is it a good time, at least in my opinion.
I'd be curious to hear from Ryan just in terms with respect to moving up the risk curve, because you're obviously a developer in the US, you're also a developer in China, and how do you think about the relative risk return in those two different markets for the same activities, and is it changing right now?
Look, I think we look at the markets very differently, and we look at what's driving that decision to enter into the development space. I mean, I think if we look at China, for instance, the whole macro story we talked about before is really important to us, but also when we look at the lack of high-quality existing assets that are in the marketplace that ultimately trade at a premium, we believe that on the development side, if you can develop at a yield to cost that is 8%, 9%, and the market is at a 4.5%, 5%, that creates an interesting investment opportunity. And I also think that when we look at going up that risk curve, we typically associate that with, well, the assets that you're buying an income-producing asset, or you're doing development, repositioning, or whatever that strategy is. I think what's interesting in some regards in China, at least as a foreign investor developer in that market, we have very limited leverage. So the amount of leverage debt that you can take on is controlled effectively by the government. And in many of the projects that we engage in China, we have residential pre-sales capital that comes in during the development stage. And so our actual leverage is very, very low, which means that if it takes slightly longer to stabilize the asset, it's okay. You have that time and you have that duration. And I'd argue that if you go and you acquire an existing asset, but you have higher leverage, 70, 80%, 90% in some cases, that is significantly riskier than in some ways engaging in development. So I think it really depends. In the U.S., this is really, it's opportunistic in terms of where we think the economy is going in certain markets. We believe in certain key markets we're going to start to see rents go up, and to the extent, because there's a lack of new supply, new construction, if that happens, that could be a really good opportunity on a one-off basis.
So switching gears a little bit to maybe the product side. This morning we had a great presentation about the future trends, the drones, the robots, and I came out of that saying, my God, it's like, does anybody still go to the office, based on that? So should we really be worried that, there will be just no demand for office going forward? At least the office space we have today is just oversized versus, what's going to be required. So maybe, actually, Ryan, you have to develop the product as a developer.
Yeah.
How do you think both of the mega trend as well as how maybe the younger generation thinks about the office space?
Look, I think that the proliferation of mobile technology is certainly changing how people work and do business, but I don't think it's lessening the need or demand for office space. I think it's changing perhaps how they use that space and perhaps the type of product that you build. And I think that on the leading side of that is really the tech sector, but we're starting to see now, even in the consulting side and the service side, people's habits changing about how they use the space. We're seeing, for instance, greater densification, right? So in many cases, 10 people per 1,000 square foot in terms of the densification. That means that it puts a premium on real estate near transportation hubs because of the density of people getting into the buildings. It means that there's less office space for people, more open space, more collaborative space, a lot more flexibility in order of how to use those floor plates. We're seeing in the case of a lot of our tenants an interest in having natural ventilation, for instance, so operable windows, access to a roof deck, incorporating some of the natural elements within the building. And I think that amenities and management of the buildings have changed too. So I give you two examples. In San Francisco recently, we did a large lease with LinkedIn to occupy 450,000 square feet of space. And LinkedIn had a requirement that they wanted more space for bicycle use, and they wanted locker rooms. And the reason was that a lot of their employees ride their bike to work, and so that amenity was important to them. They also wanted some flexibility on our policy with regard to pets, which is a little harder for us to accept, but they occupy the whole building. But you see the changes of those dynamics. And in Shanghai, we built Nike's headquarters for Greater China, and we put a basketball court in their office lobby, right? And I think so. Those types of amenities are becoming increasingly important to companies and how they use their space.
Zhou? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the key word, as I think Ryan was referring to, is functionality. And the functionality of the space is changing dramatically. The quantum per employee has decreased by, I don't know, at least a third, maybe a little bit more. And the locational preferences are changing to transportation hubs, to being in a vibrant city, you know, where there's a lot of services and activities and the like. You're seeing, you know, many of the Silicon Valley employers moving more of their operations into San Francisco, for example. Certainly what's happened in Midtown West and Lower Manhattan has dramatically changed the New York office market. So there's still demand, but it's different functionality and to some degree different locational requirements.
And do young Chinese, do they look at office space differently? Or no?
这个我真的研究不多，但是互联网肯定会change something.
Okay. Understood. Yes. One last topic on products. You know, sustainability. Does anybody care anymore on this, or is that like something from the past? I haven't heard it much. You know, so do you guys care? Really?
I think it's driven by the tenants.
Yes.
I think it's absolutely right. You know, it's now as important as any lease term and the economics. I think it's fully been internalized, embedded in the market.
Yeah, I agree. Is it a prerequisite for every building that we buy? It has to be, you know, have the highest green standards. That's not true right now. Having said that, if you were to look at our investment memos, we now note what it's LEED certified, and 10 years ago that wouldn't have made it in the memo. So that's clearly a trend. But I think, you know, obviously, in terms of the dynamics that form investment decisions, you know, supply, demand, obviously always is the paramount.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it is important to us, and I think it is driven by the tenant. And I'm not sure that we would necessarily get more rent because we have a LEED certified or a LEED gold building, but I do think that when tenants are comparing their options, it comes into their calculation as to where they want to go and where they want to locate. You know, and I think especially as we think about China, air quality control and the rest of it is incredibly important to people these days.
Good. We're going to come to audience questions very soon. You know, before that, I'm going to do my little quiz. As you know, real estate people have a trading mentality. So as a trader, you can either be long or you can either be short. Huh? There's only two ways to go as a trader. So I'm going to say one word, and you have to answer long or short. You know, there's no in between, unfortunately, and unfortunately, no room for many explanations. So let's start with the first word. Abenomics.
Short.
Long.
Long.
Short.
Brazil World Cup organization.
Short.
Short.
I think it's going to be a great World Cup.
Okay. Brazil World Cup.
世界杯 long.
No. Okay.
It's football in Brazil. We got to be long.
Okay. Euro. Zhou.
I take the Fifth Amendment.
Okay. Does not exist in Europe, either, but that's okay. You know, we'll go.
As in the currency.
That's right.
Yeah.
You're asking real estate people about currency. It's always dangerous, but I would probably say short.
Okay.
Short.
Also.
Oh, wow. I'm getting a little bit anxious here. Okay. India.
Long run, long, short run, probably long.
With such enthusiasm.
His trading position is not so clear. That's okay. Chris.
We are long.
Oh yeah, you have no.
Okay, long.
Long.
Good.
Let's
Long.
just, by the way, let's note that this is the first conference in the last 6 years where anybody's been long in India. That's good to hear.
That's good news. You're right. You're right. Okay, U.S. secondary.
Painful for me to say that.
U.S. secondary cities.
Long.
Short.
Long. But it's just not all the second-tier cities. Just some cities you mentioned, Seattle, Boston.
Those are
pretty
first-tier cities.
Second-tier
Detroit.
cities. Yeah.
Cleveland.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. I understand it's difficult. Let's go for a more clear one. New York Prime Office. Zhou.
Long run, long. Short run, short.
No, you did that already once. Okay, now. Okay. Chris?
Say long.
Okay.
Long.
Okay.
Long.
China urbanization.
Long.
Everybody's
Long.
long. Yeah. Long. Okay, fine. I understand. So China, tier 3 cities.
I don't know.
What element, like the residentials or your retail or anything?
As an investment place, yeah, anything.
Short-term, short.
No idea. I don't know.
Tier city in China?
Tier city is quite complicated.
Okay, understood.
Quite complicated. Some tier cities also quite, it's also quite developed.
Good.
But still some just a start. Yes, also quite complicated. There's too many cities in China.
Good answer.
Third-tier cities, I think we're short.
Okay, maybe an easier one. Putin.
Short.
I'll pass on
You
that.
pass, okay. I shouldn't ask political questions. Sorry for that. So maybe another one. Obamacare. I don't live in the US, so maybe Fifth Amendment works for that one.
I
no?
don't know. No
That's
opinion.
more complicated than third-tier
Yeah.
cities in China.
Yeah. Can we go back to real estate?
Okay. I'm going to make it very easy then. France, my home country.
Oh, I'm sorry to say short.
Short,
Probably short.
short,
Sure.
short.
Paris long. The rest of it, maybe not.
I want to finish on a good note. ULI.
Long.
Very good. Okay, good. So it's now time for some questions. I think we have the privilege to have really seasoned real estate professionals here on stage. So please don't hesitate to ask some good questions. Oh, there's next. Oh, there's a question over there. Perfect. Maybe introduce yourself. It would be great. Yes.
I'm Sujata Gawada from Hong Kong, Managing Director of UDP International and ULI Trustee. I have a question. I've heard through the Urban Regeneration Project in Shanghai that people don't like to rent in China. Rental market is not popular. Is that, how true is that? In other words, there are some buildings that are vacant because people don't want them to be rented because nobody else will buy afterwards. Is that, sounds strange, but is it true?
首先，其实每个人都希望拥有自己的房子，然后呢，他不喜欢租房子住，首先是必须他有房子住，他没有房子住的时候，他就必须租房子住。其实中国也一样，国外也一样，我觉得。我不知道能不能回答到了你的问题。其实是的，就是中国人可能更 eager to 拥有自己的一套房子吧。但你说是为什么中国人不喜欢去租房子住？是因为中国其实它的房屋的拥有量，个人房屋的拥有量，其实在全世界里边，它是拥有量是相对比较多的一个，可能有90%几的中国人是拥有自己的房子的，可能不管是大的小的，包括是农村的。农村的人也是基本上都是拥有自己的一个小片房子，然后在很多的劳工到 到上海去工作，到城市工作，或者是很多大学毕业生刚刚工作的话，其实每个人他都必须租房子住，那是没有那个没有选择的。然后在大城市里边有一些投资者，他买了房子之后，他没有把它出去，可能是因为中国现在的租金是很低的 ，rental income just about 2% in Shanghai or Beijing， 所以他们会觉得呢，租出去，然后很多人的习惯不是特别好，不会太去保护你的房子的话，当你租了几年2年之后，你把它收回来，你这个 renovation 的费用会比你的租金还要多，所以他们不愿意去出租。大概会是这样情况。谢谢。
So there's a question over there, I believe.
It's interesting.
Chris Mancini from Zhou.
The microphone may be on that part.
I've got one here.
Okay, so please stand up. I don't know where you. Thank you.
Chris Mancini from Savills, Japan. So why down on Abenomics in 100 words or less?
Sorry, was that directed to me?
For whoever, there were
short.
2 shorts
Yeah.
on the Abenomics
Yeah.
speed round.
Yeah,
I'm curious for elaboration.
I can speak for myself, and maybe I was interpreting the question more broadly, but I just think that there, as a short-term monetary initiative, it's positive. But in terms of its ability to stimulate the Japanese economy and indeed restructure that economy over the longer term, I'm more pessimistic about that. Obviously the demographic is quite challenging in Japan, and not unlike the United States for that matter. I think there needs to be fiscal and other initiatives to really get the economy going. So maybe I took a little broader interpretation than how the question was literally expressed.
I could just add that quantitative easing does do wonder. It did in other countries,
Feels great.
The US.
It's like a lot of things that feel great for a while.
Any other views? No? Okay. Other questions in the audience? Yes, over there.
Oh, man.
Hello there. My name is Darren. I work for Primerica Real Estate Investors based out of Singapore. You talked a lot about your uses of capital, but not so much about your sources of capital. Could you perhaps talk about any emerging long-term trends in that space, and perhaps hint at what the long-term relevance is of real estate investment managers in the real estate industry?
I can't hear the question.
So if I understood the question, what is the source of your capital? And it's true we haven't covered that part.
More emerging trends in your your sources of capital.
Chris?
Maybe I'll start. In terms of, our capital is primarily from institutions, and I think the trend that we've seen, and I don't know whether I would characterize it as emerging as much as it's just a trend that's been in place for a few years now, and I think it's going to continue, is that capital is becoming more and more globalized, and also that Asia is rising as a total percentage of the capital that we raise globally, and I think our view is that that's going to continue, and that the implication of that is that probably as it relates to managers in the industry, that managers that have a global perspective, I think in some ways differentiate themselves from managers that maybe are more sector focused or country focused, because as these global investors the world over are allocating capital, they're really looking for partners where they have synergies with them in terms of looking at the US or Europe, or having the conversations that we've had here today. And I think that's a trend that's going to continue.
Okay. One more question over there.
Hi, I'm Rick Santos from CBRE in the Philippines.
Please speak up, because we have a tough time hearing you here.
Yeah, I'm Rick Santos from CBRE in the Philippines. The appetite for investment within Southeast Asia. I know that, Zhou, you successfully acquired and then disposed of an office portfolio in the Philippines. I know that was, whether that was a good experience or bad experience, but in general, just a question to the panel, appetite for investment in the emerging markets of Southeast Asia, Philippines, India, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam.
I didn't get it.
So appetite for, you know, emerging Asia, Vietnam, Philippines, sorry, South Asia, you know, ASEAN.
I would say, I mean, we're not in Southeast Asia, but it's something that we're starting to look at. I think that there are interesting opportunities and also some very interesting macro trends that are in many of those countries. So we're in that process of looking at a number of markets, but we haven't done anything at this point.
We're similarly positioned.
I think there was one last question over there. Yep.
Chris Malalou, formerly of Lendlease. If you were to have a conversation with your younger self, where would you base yourself in the world and in terms of employment in the next 5 or 10 years?
We have a tough time hearing the question here on the stage, funnily enough. You know, maybe the audience... Can you rephrase it once more?
Where would you base yourself? If you're having a conversation with your younger self, where would you base yourself in the next 5 or 10 years for your work position?
Okay. Where would you base yourself?
Hong Kong.
In 5 or 10 years?
I mean, I'm in Shanghai and I'm a little bit biased, but I would say Shanghai. I think it's an incredibly dynamic place, and I think the Chinese market's going to continue to be an incredibly dynamic market to invest in.
And maybe even more serious or thoughtful answer for me. I think I would base myself in one of the world leading cities, whether it's Shanghai, New York, London, Hong Kong, Tokyo. I think those cities are going to distance themselves and continue to distance themselves, San Francisco, etc.
I think it depends on what one wants to do. If one has a feeling that they may want to be in the financial side or the services side, I would say go to one of the leading cities. If one is interested in development, you know, I would probably go to a rapidly growing market, whether it was domestic or foreign, where I could get as much hands-on experience as possible. So I think it really depends directionally, not specifically, but directionally what one's gut is telling them or her.
Thank you. Any concluding remarks from the participants, Andrew? Or?
我跟他们差不多一样，我还是我在上海待了蛮长一段时间，可能对我来讲，一个香港一个上海是我待的时间最长的，我对上海还是蛮喜欢的。从我所做的行业来讲，那个房地产金融，那么会更关注今后那个房地产的发展和那个房地产金融的投资的一个情况，我也依然会觉得。中国的未来的房地产投资还是一个蛮好的一个市场，可能短期会有一点那个辛苦的阶段，但中长线我还是看好的，我还会待在上海。谢谢。
Great. I personally would vote for Tokyo, but that's where I live. So thank you very much, and let's give a big applause to our panelists.